For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that Russia accounts for 40% of India's crude oil imports? And 3 years ago, this proportion was in single digits. Do you know that India has the fourth largest crude oil refining capacity in the world? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host Anil Padmanabhan. In the last 3 years, India's imports of crude oil from Russia have surged. In fact, they now account for 40% of the country's crude oil imports. All this while Russia continues to be under sanctions imposed by the Western bloc of nations. In fact, some call this India's crude oil heist. Significantly, barring the occasional outrage, mostly India has got a pass on its actions, which, on the face of it, defy global sanctions. Why? To understand this and more, we spoke to Harsh Pant, Professor of International Studies at King's College London and one of the foremost experts on strategic affairs. I began with the obvious. How did India pull off this diplomatic feat?
I think, in some ways, this is a reflection of India's growing acceptance in the global order, that it was able to manage the transition from a pre-Ukrainian world order to a post-Ukrainian one, where the fault lines between Russia and the West got sharpened. So I think for India to be in a unique position at that juncture, where it could reasonably make an argument to the West that being an important country for the West, for the Indo-Pacific, for managing the transition that is happening vis-a-vis China, we need to continue to enhance our capabilities. And economically weakened India would be of no use to anyone. So I think that argument in some ways has been very, has been taken on board. And the West has not really been, they have talked about it, their media has written about it. The Western governments have been relatively nonchalant about India's buying oil from Russia and continuing to buy oil from Russia. And the other thing that India did, of course, was to highlight the entire hypocrisy of the West, to say that, look, a lot of the countries were so deeply entrenched with Russia economically and especially in the energy sector, that for them to point fingers at a country like India that was starting from a very low base, Russia was not really India's energy partner before Ukraine, was devoid of any factual basis. So in some ways, facts as well as the growing acceptance of India as an emerging player in the global order helped India navigate this transition. And of course, Russia was in need of partners. So I think India's, I think for Russia to put all its, eggs in Chinese basket would not really have been very prudent. So in some ways, India emerged as an important interlocutor for Russia if it wanted to retain some independence of action vis-a-vis China. It may not really work in the long term, but at least in the short term, it could demonstrate to China that, look, you are not the only country that is taking oil from us. India is there. India played to that. India played to the Western sensitivities on this question. And I think diplomatically pulling this off perhaps has been one of the finer displays of Indian diplomatic acumen that we have seen in recent years. Given that very contrasting and competing interests that different stakeholders have in this issue, India was able to manage and get out of it relatively well. And manage its domestic economic situation very, very well, given the turbulence in the global market. I think that in some ways underscores the governance ability that India has generated over the years in terms of managing both the external and the domestic front. And how increasingly Indian policymakers also realize that there is no distinction between domestic and foreign. What is happening abroad is shaping your national priorities, and what you do domestically reverberate across the world. So I think that has been a very important learning curve for India as well.
Harsh, we'll come back to this diplomatic maneuver in a bit, but I just want to flesh out this what India has pulled off. It's see, importing cheap crude is one thing, but it is value adding and re-exporting it, and at a pretty good markup, and that too to Europe. So, how is Europe taking this entire exchange that's happening, given that they have to bear the bill of the sanctions against Russia, and barring a few outrages here and there, generally India seems to be getting a pass from Europe too.
Oh yes, I think Europe has been giving India a pass on this issue, and in some ways, the I think the over the top reaction that we saw in the initial few months after Ukraine allowed India that space to make a very cogent argument to Europe that look, Europe is the reason, in some ways, why Russia felt initially it has leverage over Europe. So given how entrenched Russia was in the energy sector, if you look at even at an economy like Germany, it was remarkable how entrenched the relationship was. Now, Germany has actually done very well in terms of reducing that dependence on Russia in a relatively short period of time. But that does not take away from the fact that the entrenchment that Russia had in the energy sector in Europe allowed India and India's claim certain credence that look, India is of course is starting from a very low base. India is a relatively poor country, but here are countries which are relatively rich, advanced, and countries that that have been enjoying the fruits of Russian energy. Should not really be commenting on a very relatively low base country like India, which is just starting off its engagement with Russia on the energy front. So I think the Europeans themselves gave India an opening in the initial few months, and India latched on to it. But I think the other aspect, of course, has been India's communication strategy has been very effective. That India not only publicly told its side of the story, that look, when you point a finger at India, remember that you are also part of this game, but also in some ways convincing Europe that if India were not part of this dynamic, the energy market would really shoot off the roof. That you would have a real problem at your hands if India was not buying Russian oil, and that would in some ways impact Europe, which has been reeling under economic distress. So already, there were divisions within Europe about the future of this war, the future of this conflict, how to manage Russia, and the economic costs have been very biting. And there have been concerns how far Europeans can take this on. And I think India's argument that India's role is critical not only for itself, but for the global energy market also assuage some of those concerns. And I think broadly, therefore, when you see Europe and European governments, I would say, have been generally nonchalant, generally positive about India's engagement. We increasingly see this argument that, look, India's ties with Russia are India's business, and how India deals with it is India's business. So I think India has been able to communicate its constraints, its opportunities, and the opportunities that lie therein for Europe in India's opportunities. I think so. There is an interesting tale here that one can weave. That it is, that Europeans have been very pragmatic in this case. They have not been ideological. They have realized that India buying this oil is not only good for India, it is good for the global market.
Harsh is making a very important point here. India has been able to redefine the global perception about it. Is this because of a paradigm shift in thinking, where it sees itself as part of the solution and no longer as a country that is part of the problem?
Yes, I think very fair. I would say that the whole paradigm shift we are seeing that whenever in the past there used to be a crisis, we would raise our hands up in the air and say, "Oh my God, there's a crisis is coming. What do we do? How do we get out of it?" Today, I think looking at those crises as opportunities has become a very interesting phenomenon in Indian diplomacy, in Indian way of thinking, in Indian style of governance. And I think that has given India enormous leverage, whichever way you look at it. And I think this particular case that we are discussing is just one example of that. But there are other examples, and there are plethora of issues on which India has gone ahead and said, "Look, this is our moment." Whether you see it in terms of vaccines, whether you see it in terms of China plus one strategy, whether you see it in terms of semiconductors today. I think this idea that, look, this is our moment. We are, a very important cog in the global economic wheel, and we need to play up to our strengths. And I think this example that we are discussing, the energy crisis, this allowed India to make that argument that given how important India is becoming in the global energy market, why not? Why shouldn't India make this argument that, look, we are not here simply for us. We are also here as a benevolent actor. And I think that is a very interesting way to look at it. For example, Chinese have not made this argument. Chinese are still making this argument that no, it is, they keep on buying all the oil for themselves. And I think despite all the disinformation campaign that they run, that public diplomacy on this issue has been remarkably ineffective because China is seen as part of the problem. Whereas India increasingly is seen as part of the problem, is part of the solution.
There's a method to India's newfound boldness on the diplomatic front. It has a lot to do with its willingness to give and take at the global high table. It is willing today, as a responsible country, to make sacrifices for global good.
Yes, I think that is that narrative somehow is now building up. That for a large part of our history, we were always very good at pointing fingers at others. We were very good at articulating problems. But when it came to solutions, we were missing in action. Part of it is, of course, we did not have the capabilities to make a difference. But today we are more confident. We are confident not only about the challenges we are facing, but the world is facing and what our role can be, as part of those challenges. And climate change is a very good example. And one has to give credit to the Modi government here in terms of how they brought in a paradigm shift, where, of course, the argument remains that the West and the developed world has to do more on climate finance, more on climate adaptation, and then bringing technologies, sharing technologies that are needed. But I think fundamentally the argument today is that we have to do our bit as well, that we cannot simply shy away from our commitments, from our responsibilities. And that argument has been made very effectively by Indian leadership to the domestic population. Because in the past, the domestic population, the argument that I think policymakers were making to the domestic population was that, you don't worry, our only focus is economic growth. Because that is needed, we are not going to make any changes. And we are going to also push back against Western hegemony or the hegemony of the developed world. I think that narrative has changed. This idea that, look, of course, there are problems that have been created by the West or by the developed world, and they need to shoulder greater responsibility in helping us. But I think the sense that we are making, the argument that we are making to our own people today is, it is our responsibility as well. We need to shoulder some of that burden, and we are willing to move beyond just saying it is your problem. So whether it is taking on commitments that we are doing much better at than many people expected, or even articulating it through global platforms like International Solar Alliance, that this partnerships that we are creating, where we are saying we will solve some of these problems by creating new platforms, by creating new institutions, by taking on more commitments, I think is radically changing the perception of India as a country that also contributes to the global order.
No doubt, India's diplomatic maneuvering deserves credit. Yet, it is also a fact that India was a case of being at the right place at the right time.
Absolutely. I think, and the biggest, help to India, one should send a thank you note to Xi Jinping, because he has been really, the way he has governed China and the way he has managed China's external partnerships, that has given India enormous space to maneuver. And if it were not for China's belligerence, if it were not for the kind of consensus you see on China today in the West and in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think India's space would have been as broad, as wide as it is today. So certainly India is at a very important moment in the way it is transitioning and in the way the global order is transitioning. So I think both together have given India several opportunities. But, Anil, in the past also India has had many opportunities that we have missed. We are famous for missing, several buses in the past. So I think even today there is a challenge. There are so many opportunities. Are we ready for exploiting them? I think the government of the day is saying that they are willing to take certain risks, that they are willing to, put the feet on the accelerator and see how far it goes. But I think it is also something that we'll have to, as a nation, think in terms of building our capacities. How far can we mobilize our resources? because this is a long-term game. This is not going to end today or tomorrow. The world is shifting. The parameters are shifting. There is almost a paradigm shift in the way we look at the global order. And India, as you said, happens to be at the right, at the right moment, at the right place. And if Indian diplomacy, if Indian policymakers don't take advantage of this, then I think we will be doing it once again 10 years down the line. So the sense that you get is that I think the policymakers are aware, and they are sort of trying to do this, what is perhaps feasible at the moment. But I think as a nation, we need to be more aware of this. So, you often feel there is, even today, a sense of despondency in certain quarters. At the moment you start articulating, that India is doing this, there are 20 people who will tell you how this cannot be done. I think that mentality has always been a problem for India. And that perhaps, to a certain extent, this government has been able to, remove from the discourse. But again, India is a democracy. Tomorrow there'll be another government, and the changes in governments will come and go. But is there a national consensus? And is this moment of time being appreciated by everyone, every stakeholder, not only the government, but also the private sector? How far are they willing to go? Indian private sector has always been very reticent in taking risks, at least abroad. So I think this is a moment for everyone to think through whether we can build institutions that are resilient enough, that can take this, that can utilize this moment to their advantage.
You heard Harsh. India today is exhibiting unprecedented boldness and risk-taking ability on the global stage, even as it continues to strengthen its domestic economy. Combined with deft diplomatic maneuvering, as well as the geopolitical reset, it is helping India redefine the global perception about it. It is transforming from a country which is perceived to be normally part of the problem. Instead, it is now seen as a country which is part of the solution. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And if you like the show, please do hit the like button. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.